A thin, elderly woman, her hands trembling as she tightly clutches a paper bag filled with documents, could never have imagined that a routine trip to the bank would turn into a nightmare. After more than 30 years of loyalty to this bank, she was kicked out simply because she couldn't use a smartphone app. The humiliation and the cold stares from those around her made her feel like the entire world was turning its back on her. But just when it seemed that injustice had crushed her last hope, a stranger appeared. No one else. It was none other than NBA legend Shaquille O'Neal, who stepped into her life to change everything. What happens next will make you reflect on the power of kindness and the fight for what is right. Follow this inspiring story, and don't forget to hit subscribe to our channel so we can share more meaningful stories like this one. We'd love to know where you're watching from, so please share in the comments. Helen Thompson slowly walked through the glass doors of First Capital Bank. The cold light from the fluorescent bulbs shone onto the glossy marble floor, creating a sense of alienation that made her pause for a moment to regain her composure. This had once been her monthly destination, as familiar as her own kitchen. But today, the bank seemed to have become a completely distant place. Helen, wearing a faded old wool coat and carrying a worn-out cloth bag, slowly approached the teller counter. In her bag, she carried all the documents she thought could prove her identity: a savings book, utility bills, her husband's veteran certificate, and even a letter from the bank sent a few months earlier. Her hands tightened around the bag as she thought about why she was there. Her husband, George, who had stood by her through every up and down in life, was waiting at home. George had just had his treatment regimen changed by the doctor this morning. He needed a new medication costing nearly $500, and Anderson's drugstore would close at 5 p.m. Helen knew that if she didn't buy the medicine in time, George's health would deteriorate further, but she had no choice but to go to the bank. Her steps, steady from decades of facing hardships, now trembled under the pressure of her circumstances. The old flip phone in her pocket was of no help. It could only make basic calls. That was all she needed until today. But now, it seemed like a symbol of helplessness. Helen approached the teller counter. In front of her was a young employee wearing wireless headphones and typing on a computer. She raised her voice to get attention. "Hello," Helen said, her voice small but still polite. "I'd like to withdraw money from my savings account." The teller looked up, glanced at her briefly, then back to the screen. "Have you set up our banking app?" she asked, her tone even. Helen hesitated. "I don't have a smartphone," she replied, gently pulling her savings book from her bag. "But I have all the necessary documents here." The teller paused, glancing at Helen through her thin-framed glasses. "I'm sorry, but your account hasn't been digitally verified. This is a new policy and we can't make exceptions." "What policy?" Helen asked, confused. The bank employee took a deep breath, her voice still unchanged. "According to the new regulations, all accounts must be linked to our banking app. Without digital verification, we can't process transactions. This policy was implemented after the bank merger." Helen felt as if someone had just punched her hard. She tried to suppress the rising emotions, her voice trembling. "I've been banking here for over 30 years. I have my savings book, bills, my husband's veteran certificate. This is my money. Please." The bank employee looked at her with a look of feigned sympathy. "I'm very sorry, but the policy is the policy." "But my husband needs medicine," Helen continued, tears beginning to well in her eyes. "He's at home. I just need to withdraw money to buy his medicine. Please, help me." The bank employee hesitated for a moment before calling security over the intercom. "You're disturbing other customers. I'll have security assist you." Two security guards, one tall and one shorter, approached. "Ma'am, please step outside," the tall guard said, his voice polite but firm. Helen felt her knees give way. She tried to gather her documents, but her trembling hands caused them to fall to the marble floor, scattering everywhere. Prescriptions, the veteran certificate, and an old photo of her and George fell out of her bag. A few customers in the bank began to take notice. An elderly woman whispered to the person next to her, "This is unacceptable. How can they treat her like that?" But no one stepped forward to help. The security guards bent down, reluctantly picking up Helen's papers before handing them back to her. "Please leave immediately," the shorter guard repeated. Helen couldn't speak another word. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she left the bank, the harsh afternoon sun shining on her tear-streaked face. Outside the bank, Helen sat down on a nearby bench, her frail hands trembling as she picked up the scattered documents. The crumpled prescription, the electric bill, and the old photo of her and George from their youth lay before her. In the photo, George, then a young soldier, smiled proudly in his uniform. Helen recalled their difficult but meaningful years together, building a family, working together to raise their children. But now, she felt she was failing to protect the man she loved most. Helen bowed her head, her shoulders shaken, and tears began to flow continuously. Inside her old cloth bag, the flip phone lay silent, useless. How could they treat me like this? Helen wondered, her hand tightening around the bag as if seeking some comfort within it. Meanwhile, inside the bank, murmurs began to rise. A middle-aged man said with annoyance, "She's been a customer here her whole life. It's so shameful." But no one took action. Helen remained sitting there, powerless. Only one question echoed in her mind. What can I do to save George? Helen sat quietly on the bench near the bank, the afternoon sunlight highlighting every wrinkle on her face. Her red-rimmed eyes watched the papers fluttering around her feet, a light breeze blowing some of them farther away, as if testing her endurance. Helen leaned forward, trying to pick them up, but her frail, trembling hands couldn't manage. An important paper, the prescription for George, was blown a little farther away. She reached forward to grab it, but lost her balance and had to brace herself on the bench. She sighed, her eyes dimming in the harsh sunlight. Inside her old cloth bag was a faded old photo that had fallen out along with the documents. It was a picture of her and George in their youth, when he was a young, strong soldier. George stood in his uniform, smiling proudly, while Helen stood beside him with eyes bright with hope. She reached out a trembling hand to pick up the photo, gazing at it for a long time. In her memories, George had always been her strongest support. But now, he was thin, exhausted from cancer, and she couldn't do anything to help him except sit here, powerless and bewildered. How could this happen to me? She whispered to herself. George needs me. He's always been there for me through every hardship. Now I can't do anything for him. Helen quietly wiped her tears. What had happened in the bank still felt like a knife slicing into her self-esteem. As someone who had lived her whole life honestly, carefully, and worked hard, she never thought she would find herself in this situation, treated like a nuisance, kicked out of the place she had trusted for 3 decades. Inside the bank, customers continued their transactions, but a silent dissatisfaction spread through the space. A middle-aged man stood in line, shaking his head. This is unacceptable. he said to the person next to him. "She's been here her whole life, and they treat her like that." The woman next to him nodded in agreement. They should be helping her, not kicking her out like this. But no one stepped outside. Those murmurs, though filled with discontent, were just quiet voices unable to change anything. At that moment, a shiny black SUV turned into the bank's parking lot. From the driver's seat stepped a tall man, exuding confidence but equally composed. It was Shaquille O'Neal, the former NBA basketball star, renowned not only for his athletic talent, but also for his meaningful charitable work. Beside him was his daughter, Mahira, a teenage girl with bright eyes, intelligent and curious. Mahira was the first to notice Helen. "Dad, look," she whispered, pulling Shaq's hand and pointing toward the bench. "Something's wrong with her." Shaq looked in the direction his daughter was pointing. He immediately recognized the unusual situation. Helen sat hunched over, her frail shoulders trembling. Papers lay scattered around her, some still on the ground. Her face was etched with anguish, and her red-rimmed eyes clearly showed her despair. Shaq didn't say a word, slowly walking toward Helen. His towering shadow loomed over her, startling her into looking up. Her tear-streaked face, she hurriedly wiped her tears with trembling hands as she saw a stranger approaching. "Are you okay?" Shaq asked, his deep, warm voice much gentler than his imposing exterior. Helen looked up, her eyes glimmering with a mix of hope and confusion. She hesitated, unsure who this man was or why he was concerned about her. After a few seconds of silence, she choked out, "I just wanted to withdraw money from the bank, to buy medicine for my husband, but they wouldn't let me. They said I need a smartphone." Shaq bent down to pick up a few scattered papers around Helen, including the old photo of her and George. He looked at the photo, his eyes softening. They were the eyes of someone who had witnessed much injustice in his life and couldn't turn a blind eye to it. "How long have you been banking here?" Shaq asked, his voice steady but full of meaning. Helen replied, her voice trembling, "Over 30 years. Never had any problems, but now—" Her voice trailed off, and her eyes welled up again. Mahira stood beside them, listening to Helen's story. She bent down to pick up the photo of George and stared at it thoughtfully. "Dad, she's lived her whole life giving," she said, handing the photo to Shaq. "They can't treat her like this." Shaq looked at the photo, his eyes showing a hint of emotion. He sat down beside Helen, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Don't worry," he said firmly. "We'll go back to the bank and resolve this." Helen looked at him, her eyes full of confusion. "But they kicked me out." She hesitated, fearing that going back would only lead to more humiliation. But Shaq's eyes, the eyes of someone who had fought for what was right, made her feel she could trust him. Sometimes, people need to be reminded that they're dealing with a person, not just a file, Shaq said resolutely. He reached out his hand to help Helen stand. "Let me handle this for you, and for your husband." Helen, with tear-filled eyes but brimming with gratitude, simply nodded. Together with Mahira and Shaq, she walked toward the bank door, where just minutes before she had left in humiliation and helplessness. But this time, she no longer felt alone. Shaq, the towering man with a big heart, was standing by her side. Helen slowly walked through the bank doors, this time without the fear and shame she had felt before. Walking beside her was Shaquille O'Neal, the tall man exuding confidence, and her daughter Mahira, who was recording every moment on her phone. Their presence immediately attracted everyone's attention in the bank. The usually bustling but cold atmosphere now became tense. Whispers began to spread throughout the room, and some customers hurriedly pulled out their phones to film. Helen bowed her head, still unaccustomed to this sudden attention. But when she looked up, her eyes met the familiar faces of some elderly customers, those who had once been her neighbors or colleagues in the community. A few nodded at her, their eyes full of empathy and support. This gave Helen a bit of courage. Shaq led Helen straight to the teller counter, where she had been turned away just minutes earlier. The young teller, who had previously called security to escort her out, immediately paled upon seeing them approach. She sat up straight, her eyes betraying worry. She quickly typed a few lines into the computer, pretending to be busy but unable to hide her confusion. Shaq stood in front of the teller counter, his massive frame dominating the surrounding area. He spoke in a deep but clear voice that echoed throughout the bank. "Mrs. Thompson needs to withdraw money from her account. Why did you refuse her?" The young teller stammered, not daring to look Shaq directly in the eye. "Sir, it's because of the bank's policy. We require all accounts to be verified through the digital app. This is a new regulation and there are no exceptions." Shaq lightly tapped the counter, creating a small but authoritative sound that made the already silent space even more oppressive. He leaned toward the teller, his gaze stern but not angry. "No exceptions, you say? Which policy is so heartless as to prevent an elderly woman, a loyal customer for over 30 years, from withdrawing her own money?" The teller didn't respond, her hands trembling as she typed on the keyboard. She glanced toward the manager's office, seemingly seeking help. Noticing the situation, a woman in a gray business suit stepped out of the glass office. It was Rebecca Stevens, the branch manager, a woman in her early 30s with an intelligent but somewhat stressed face. Rebecca hurried to the teller counter, her high heels clicking sharply on the marble floor. She saw Shaq and immediately recognized who he was. Her eyes settled on Helen, and she caught a glimpse of the old papers Helen was holding. She took a deep breath, maintaining a calm voice. "Hello, Mr. O'Neill. I'm Rebecca Stevens, the manager of this branch. How can I help you?" Shaq didn't answer immediately. He turned to Helen, then looked at Rebecca. "She doesn't need my help. You are the ones who need to help her. I want to know why you kicked her out of the bank when she just wants to withdraw money from her own account." Rebecca tried to maintain her professionalism, but her eyes showed worry as all the customers paid attention to the conversation. Some customers were recording videos, increasing the pressure she felt. She looked at Helen, trying to find a reasonable explanation. "Sir, I'm very sorry about this situation. However, our bank has just implemented new security policies requiring digital verification through the banking app. This is to ensure customer safety and prevent fraudulent activities. According to the regulations, we cannot process transactions for any accounts that have not been verified. This is a general policy, and I cannot go against it." After hearing this, Shaq narrowed his eyes. He stood tall, his imposing presence creating an invisible pressure in the room. His voice lowered, but each word was delivered with certainty. "Do you know who she is? She's a part of this community. She's been coming to this bank every month for the past 30 years without any issues. And now, just because she doesn't have a smartphone, you want to deny her? This isn't security. This is heartlessness." Rebecca swallowed hard, looking at Helen with hesitant eyes. She knew Shaq was right, but the warnings from her superiors still echoed in her head. Do not violate the regulations. The consequences will be severe." Shaq took another step forward, causing Rebecca to instinctively step back. He continued, his voice strong but not harsh. "Policies are meant to serve people, not harm them. If you refuse to help her today, I will help her transfer all her money to another bank. And I promise you, this story will go viral. Do you want that?" The atmosphere in the bank seemed to freeze. Rebecca felt hundreds of eyes fixed firmly on her. The whispers from the customers grew louder. A woman nearby shouted, "Help her! It's the right thing to do." Rebecca glanced at the wall clock. It was nearly 4:50 p.m. The pharmacy where Helen needed to buy medicine was about to close. Rebecca sighed, as if she had to make a difficult decision but had no other choice. "All right," she said, her voice small but clear. "We will make an exception. I will take responsibility." Helen looked at Rebecca, her eyes surprised but full of gratitude. "Thank you. Thank you so much. My husband, he needs the medicine." Rebecca nodded, signaling the teller to proceed. Meanwhile, Shaq stood quietly beside Helen, his eyes full of reassurance. When the money was handed to Helen, she held the envelope tightly, tears streaming down her cheeks. She turned to Shaq, not knowing what to say except a trembling. "Thank you. Thank you so much. You're a good man." Shaq smiled, leaning down to look at Helen. "You don't need to thank me. Take care of your husband. You've done everything for him, and that is truly admirable." As Helen left the bank, the surrounding customers applauded. Mahira was still filming. Capturing the moment, Shaq turned to shake Rebecca's hand and said to her, "Thank you for choosing the right thing. But remember, policies are meant to serve people, not hurt them." Rebecca nodded, her face gradually relaxing into a slight smile. Helen walked away, feeling lighter than ever, and Shaq, with his towering presence and big heart, had brought hope not only to Helen, but also to those who witnessed this meaningful story. Helen exited the bank with the envelope of money in her hand, clutching it tightly as if it were her entire world at that moment. Tears still streamed down her cheeks, but this time not from shame or despair. They were tears of relief and deep gratitude. She turned back to look at the bank's glass doors, where Shaquille O'Neal and her daughter Mahira were still standing, their eyes full of concern. She gave a slight nod of thanks, her trembling lips unable to form words. Shaq waved goodbye to her, offering an encouraging smile. Mahira turned to her father, her eyes sparkling. "Dad, we really did something meaningful today," the girl said, her voice full of enthusiasm. "I'm so glad we helped her." Shaq smiled, gently patting his daughter's shoulder. "Sweetie, sometimes the smallest actions can make the biggest difference. But remember, we do this not for praise, but to remind everyone that compassion still exists." Mahira nodded, clutching her phone tightly. "Dad, I think everyone needs to know this story. It will be a lesson for many people." Shaq looked at his daughter, his eyes gentle but resolute. "If you share it, make sure the story doesn't stop here. Let it spread the message that people must prioritize kindness over every regulation." Helen quickly hailed a taxi to Anderson's drugstore. She told the driver urgently, "Please, take me to the pharmacy on Anderson Street. My husband needs his medicine immediately." The driver, a middle-aged man with a kind smile, nodded and replied, "Don't worry, ma'am. I'll get you there as fast as I can." He accelerated, unaware that he was helping Helen save someone's life. Upon arriving at the pharmacy, Helen hurried inside, her legs still slightly trembling from everything she had just been through. The clerk at the counter recognized her and immediately remembered the morning's call about a special prescription. "Mrs. Thompson, we've prepared the medicine for your husband. Thank goodness you arrived before we closed." Helen tightly held the bag of medicine, her heart filled with relief. She paid and said, "Thank you, everyone. Today has been tough, but finally I can bring the medicine to him." When she got home, Helen opened the door and saw George sitting on the familiar armchair, his eyes fixed on the doorway as if waiting. He had grown much weaker after days of treatment, but his gentle smile upon seeing Helen still held the same familiar warmth. "I'm home," George said, his voice hoarse but still full of love. Helen quickly walked to his side, knelt down, and handed him the bag of medicine. "I got the medicine," she said, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Everything is okay now. George, we'll get through this." George looked at Helen, his eyes filled with emotion. "You're the strongest person I've ever known," he whispered. "I don't know what I'd do without you. Thank you." Helen gently placed her hand on George's. She smiled despite the tears still falling. "We've overcome so many hardships together, haven't we? This is no different." They sat there together in the small room, filled with love and connection. Helen felt a sense of relief, not just because she could help George, but because she knew she was not alone. Shaq and Mahira had helped her see the light even in the darkest moments. The next day, the story of Helen and Shaq began to spread on social media. Mahira uploaded the video of Shaq protecting Helen at the bank, accompanied by a meaningful caption. "Sometimes, heartless regulations need to be challenged by compassion. Today, I learned that a small act can change a whole life." The video quickly attracted millions of views and comments. People continuously shared the story, expressing their support for Helen and Shaq. Shaq is not just a hero on the court, he's a real-life hero. The bank needs to learn how to put people above rigid policies. This story reminds me of my grandmother. She also struggled with technology. Thank you, Shaq, for standing up for people like her. The pressure from the community forced the leadership of First Capital Bank to take action. An emergency meeting was held that same week, focusing on reevaluating the new policies. Rebecca Stevens, the branch manager who handled Helen's transaction, attended the meeting with a heavy heart. When asked to explain her actions, Rebecca frankly said, "I know I violated the regulations, but I couldn't stand by and watch a loyal customer like Mrs. Thompson be denied access to her own funds just because she doesn't have a smartphone. I believe our bank has a responsibility to prioritize people over technology." Her response left the conference room silent for a moment. Then, a member of the leadership team, who had seen the viral video, spoke up. "I think Rebecca did the right thing. This is the time we need to reconsider our approach. If we forget our responsibility to our customers, we've forgotten why the bank exists." As a result, the bank decided to change its policies, adding special support processes for elderly customers or those unfamiliar with technology. An official announcement was made, emphasizing the commitment to prioritize people over rigid regulations. A few weeks later, Shaq made an unexpected visit to Helen's home with Mahira. They brought a bag full of food, a bouquet of flowers, and a card that read, "To the two strongest people I've ever met, never forget that you are not alone. Shaq." Helen opened the door, her eyes full of surprise and emotion. "Mr. O'Neill, what brings you here?" Shaq smiled, leaning down to speak gently. "I just wanted to see how you two are doing. and I wanted to thank you for giving me the opportunity to do the right thing." George, though weak, tried to stand up from the armchair. "Thank you, sir," he said, his voice hoarse. "You helped my wife during our hardest time. It means the world to us." Shaq shook George's hand, his eyes full of respect. "No, you two are the real heroes. I was just doing my part. You've lived your lives for each other, and that's an inspiration to all of us." Helen stood there, tears streaming down her face but a satisfied smile on her lips. She knew that life was still full of good things, and moments like these would always serve as reminders that kindness has the power to change the world. Helen sat on the armchair next to George, her eyes sparkling with happiness as she looked at the bouquet of flowers and the bag of food that Shaquille O'Neal and his daughter Mahira had brought. Their small, cozy home seemed to brighten up thanks to their unexpected visit. George, though weak, tried to stand up from the familiar chair to shake Shaq's hand once more. His frail hands were firmly grasped by Shaq's, the stark contrast between the two, one side towering and strong, the other frail and weak, but both exuding mutual respect. "Mr. O'Neal," George said, his voice hoarse but steadfast, "you didn't just help us get the money. You helped me regain my faith, the faith that kindness still exists in this world." Shaq leaned down, grasping George's hands with both of his eyes filled with empathy. "No need to thank me, my friend. I was just doing what anyone should do. You two have spent your lives loving and caring for each other. That deserves respect and support from all of us." Mahira stood nearby, her eyes sparkling as she looked around the small room. She noticed the simple yet meaningful details in the house: walls adorned with family photos, a small window frame letting in the morning light, and especially an old photo in a weathered wooden frame, showing George in uniform standing next to a young Helen. They held hands, smiling brightly as if the whole world belonged to them. Mahira approached Helen, took the photo, and gazed at it for a long time. "Mrs. Thompson, you and Mr. Thompson are amazing," she said admiringly. "Your love is beautiful. I hope I can find a love like that too." Helen smiled, her face full of wrinkles stretching outward. She placed a hand on Mahira's shoulder, her voice gentle but firm. "You will find it, sweetie. But remember, true love isn't just about beautiful words. It's about sacrifice, patience, and the ability to stand by each other through the toughest times. That's what makes love enduring." Shaq stood up, gave George and Helen a light pat on the shoulders before stepping out the door with Mahira. He turned back to look at them, a warm smile appearing on his face. "I'll always remember your story. It inspired me a lot." Helen saw the father and son leave to the door, watching the SUV disappear down the narrow road. She stood silently for a moment, her hands tightly clasped together. Inside, a warm feeling spread through her. She whispered to herself, "In this vast world, there are still kind-hearted people. They appear just when we need them most." The next day, the video Mahira filmed at the bank had become a social media phenomenon. In the video, Shaq stood in front of the bank manager, fiercely yet compassionately defending Helen's rights. Mahira's caption accompanying the video read, "Sometimes a small action can change a whole life. Remember, technology and regulation should never replace compassion and empathy." The video quickly amassed millions of views and hundreds of thousands of shares. Comments were filled with admiration and empathy. Shaq is not just a legend on the basketball court, but also a legend in real life. The bank needs to learn to put people above policies. This is a big lesson for them. This story reminds me of my grandmother. Thank you, Shaq and Helen, for reminding us of the value of kindness. Pressure from the community forced First Capital Bank's leadership to take action. An emergency meeting was held to discuss new policies and shortcomings in customer service. Rebecca Stevens, the branch manager who had directly handled Helen's situation, attended the meeting with a heavy heart. During the meeting, Rebecca stood up to speak, her eyes full of determination. I know I violated regulations when handling Mrs. Thompson's transaction, but I believe that if we don't remain flexible in situations like this, we've forgotten the core mission of the bank, serving people. She's not just a customer. She's a part of this community, and I can't turn my back on that. Rebecca's words silenced the entire meeting room. A senior executive who had watched the viral video spoke up. Rebecca, you're right. This video not only damages our reputation but also made me realize that we need to change our operations. If customers feel neglected or treated unfairly, we don't just lose them. We lose our reason for existence. As a result, the bank introduced a series of policy changes, including the establishment of a department specifically supporting elderly customers or those unfamiliar with technology. The bank also committed to retraining employees to enhance empathy and humanity in their service. A few weeks later, Helen received a letter from the bank. The apology letter was handwritten by Rebecca Stevens herself, accompanied by a small bouquet of flowers. In the letter, Rebecca expressed her deep regret and thanked Helen for helping her realize what truly matters in work and life. Helen read the letter, tears streaming down her face. She felt not only respected, but also recognized that her story had contributed to something greater than herself. One day, Helen received another surprise, a letter from a charity organization founded by Shaq. The letter announced that the Helen and George Thompson Scholarship Fund for Loyalty and Community Love had been established to support underprivileged students in their community. Helen couldn't believe her eyes. She turned to George, her voice choked with emotion. Do you see? We're just ordinary people, but our story has gone further than you ever imagined. George tightened his grip on her hand, his eyes shining with pride. No one is ordinary, Helen. Each of us has the power to change the world, even if it's just a little. Their small house was once again filled with light, not just from the sun, but from the faith and hope they had nurtured throughout their lives. Helen and George knew that no matter what difficulties life brought, they would always find kind-hearted people ready to help. Their story, along with Shaq's actions, would forever serve as a reminder that compassion always has the power to change the world. One sunny day, Helen and George sat by the window, enjoying a peaceful morning in their small home. George, though still in frail health, had his smile back. Helen, with her slender hands, carefully prepared each sip of tea he drank. It was a simple, yet joyful moment. The doorbell suddenly rang. Helen stood up, looked at George, and said, "Wait for me a moment." She opened the door, and this time, it wasn't just a small surprise. Standing before her were Shaquille O'Neal and Mahira, but not alone. Accompanying them was a group of students in uniforms holding large cards and a beautiful bouquet of flowers. Behind them was a group of community members who had learned about Helen and George's story through social media and wanted to express their respect. Helen covered her mouth with her hand, trying to hold back her emotions. "What's happening?" she asked, her voice trembling. Shaq stepped forward, his familiar warm smile appearing on his face. "Mrs. Thompson, Today, we're here not only to greet you, but also to tell you that your and Mr. Thompson's story has changed more people than you can imagine." Mahira held up a large sign with the words, "Helen and George, Community Heroes." A boy from the group of students stepped up, handing Helen a card with the scribbled words, "Thank you for teaching us that kindness still exists." Helen couldn't hold back her tears as she looked at the children, her trembling hands accepting the card and pressing it to her chest. George, despite his weak health, tried to walk to the door. He looked at Shaq, his voice hoarse but filled with gratitude. "You've given us more than we could have ever expected. Not just medicine, not just help. You've given us faith in ourselves and our community." Shaq approached and shook George's hand. "Mr. Thompson, you and Mrs. Thompson have taught me and all of us a lesson, that sometimes the steadfastness and silent sacrifice of a couple can inspire the whole world." That day, Helen and George not only reunited with those who had supported them, but also received an unexpected gift from Shaq. He handed them a large check, representing the funds he had donated from the charity bearing their name. The Helen and George Thompson Fund will support scholarships for children in this community, Shaq said. "It's our way of honoring your story, so your kindness and love continue to spread." Helen stood silently for a long moment. She looked at the check, then at Shaq, at the children, and finally turned to George. Her voice choked with emotion. "George, I never thought that we, two ordinary people, could achieve something so grand." George tightened his grip on her hand. "Helen, we're not just two ordinary people. It's our love that has paved the way, and Shaq has helped that spread." As the group left, Helen and George sat back in their small home, now seemingly brighter with the gifts and the laughter of children still echoing in their memories. Helen sat beside George, holding his hand. "We've been through many storms, but I've never felt prouder than today," she said gently. George smiled, his eyes gleaming with contentment. "We've lived a life worth living, Helen. And you know what? Even if it's just a small part, we've helped change the world." Helen nodded, her eyes shining as she looked out at the vast blue sky. "That's right. And it's thanks to compassion. Shaq's compassion. The compassion of those children out there and the compassion within our own hearts." Helen and George's story didn't end in a small house. It extended far beyond, becoming a symbol of kindness, love, and resilience. And in this vast world, no matter the challenges, Helen knew that compassion always has the power to overcome everything. Their story is a powerful testament that in an increasingly technology-dependent and rigid world, compassion and humanity remain guiding lights. They not only received help from Shaquille O'Neal, but also inspired the community to remember that people exist not to serve rules, but rules are created to serve people. The love and sacrifice Helen showed for George, along with Shaq's compassion, gave us a profound lesson. Sometimes small actions can change a person's entire life, even an entire community. From seemingly ordinary moments, we can make a significant difference, as long as we always prioritize our hearts and compassion above all. This story isn't just about a couple or a bank. It's a reminder that in any circumstance, we can become bearers of hope, even with a small act. Kindness has a powerful ripple effect, and the world always needs brave people to stand up for what's right. If Helen, George, and Shaq's story has touched your heart, spread this message by sharing it with others. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so we can bring you more inspiring stories like this one. Let's build a community where compassion is always prioritized. Thank you for watching. See you in the next stories.